I went to the movies last Saturday night, and I couldn't help but notice how dead it was. In years past, a Saturday night at Christmas time was a license to print money for movie theaters. Growing up, Friday and Saturday nights, especially during the summer months and over the winter holidays, were absolutely the busiest they could be. Packed movie houses with sold out screenings and repeat customers clamoring to see the same films all over again as soon as possible. When's the last time you saw any of that? It's been a while, right? Now a movie is lucky to have a decent opening before going on to streaming a few weeks later, or in some cases, at the exact same time. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Neil Chase, author of the horror novel Iron Dogs and writer-director of the supernatural thriller film Spin the Wheel. And what I want to talk about today is, why does it seem like people don't like movies as much as they used to? Or should that be, why don't people like going to the movies as much as they used to? Honestly, to me, it's the same question. Sure, we can blame the advent of streaming and video games as much as we want and say that people just aren't interested in going out to theaters anymore. But it never really explains how films like Top Gun Maverick and Barbie get butts in seats the same way movies used to back in the 80s and 90s. So what's really going on? Grab your popcorn and let's get started. Now I'm going to say something that you might find controversial. Movies peaked in the 80s and 90s. Especially in genre films. It was when we had the best storytelling on screen, the most care put into filmmaking, and the best audience reception to those movies. From budget to production to box office, it was a time when everything clicked. But hey, if we're going to compare the state of modern films to those of the past, then we should do it right. With box office records seemingly being broken all the time, how can I actually say that the 80s and 90s were the pinnacle for movies? Okay, let's do an apples to apples comparison. Let's pick a random month in the 80s versus the same month in 2024. Honestly, I could pick pretty much any month in any of the 80s and we would see films that we recognize. So I'll just say June of 1987. Why not? According to Box Office Mojo, which tracks the domestic box office for films that went wide, that is, the ones that played in at least 600 theaters, the top film of June of 1987 was The Untouchables, and it made around $76 million at the domestic box office. In contrast, the top film in June of 2024 was Inside Out 2, which made a staggering $653 million. So right away I can hear you say, what the hell's your point? What are you talking about when you say people don't like movies as much? In your own example, the more recent film made over 8 times as much money. Okay, I'll give you that. Until we start digging a little bit. First, let's adjust for inflation. You know, the idea that money today simply isn't worth as much as it used to be? According to just one of many inflation calculators I found online, the US dollar in 1987 is worth $2.78 today. And all the other inflation calculators had the same rate, so I'm not being preferential to a specific site in case you're wondering. That means The Untouchables made $211 million in today's dollars. Wow, that's already a huge difference. But wait, there's more. See, The Untouchables played in 1,500 theaters. So at $211 million, that's an average of around $140,000 per theater. As anyone working in Hollywood today will tell you, that's pretty damn good. In fact, it's amazing. What do I mean? Well, Inside Out 2 played in over 4,400 theaters for an average gross of around $148,000 per theater. That's almost the same number. And when we go down the list to the number 2 slot for June of each year, we see that 1987's number 2 made an average of $136,000 per theater, adjusted for inflation, while the 2024 number 2 made an average of only $50,000 per theater. That's a huge difference. And it only gets worse. Way worse the lower we go down the list. The number 6 slot for June of 2024, which is the bottom of the list because no other films were even released wide that month, made an average of around $2,600 per theater. While the number 6 slot in 1987 made an average of $76,000 per theater, adjusted for inflation. Even the number 9 movie for that year made around $35,000 per theater, adjusted for inflation. Apples to apples. June of 1987 not only had more movies in the theater than June of 2024, but they made more money per film and more money overall. Over $100 million more when adjusted for inflation. And if we dig even further, The Untouchables cost $25 million to make, which today would be just shy of $70 million. In contrast, Inside Out 2's reported budget is $200 million. That means the top movie in June of 1987 had a much bigger profit margin than the top movie of June 2024. So what's the takeaway? First off, the giant numbers we see today aren't really as big as they seem at first glance. Even the biggest films of today are comparable to the films of old in terms of gross earnings. Except there's way less of them. Way less. There were only 6 films in theaters in June of this year that went wide. In the 80s, there were so many that they had to cut the list off at just the top 10. So instead of making more movies at a lower budget and hence at a lower risk, the studios have gone all in on a few monster productions that cost a ton and absolutely need to make a ton just to break even, let alone make a profit. In the past, you had a studio bank on the success of a half dozen or more small to mid-budget films, and all they needed was for a few of those to break through to make a comfortable profit for that year. But as tentpole films became the norm, they also became bigger and bigger, with budgets to reflect their overblown status. And pretty soon, 10 smaller films were replaced by one big one, which absolutely had to turn a profit in order for the studio to simply survive. It's staggering to think how anyone would consider this a viable business model. Instead of spreading the risk over a number of films, they put all their eggs into a single basket and then threw that basket out the window. The worst part is, these monstrously large movies aren't any better than the films of old. Oh sure, they're very slick looking, and some of them will make huge bank, which isn't as huge as it seems at first glance, as we've already seen. And others will win tons of awards and get as much positive press as possible. But my question to you is, will anyone remember them in 40 years' time like we remember the films of the 80s today? I can quite literally pick any month in any year in the 80s and 90s, and I'll see a slew of films that are beloved to this day. Films that people have seen, not just once, but time and again. Films that they quote and know all the characters and actors. Films that have entire fandoms and memorabilia that sells to this day. Films that have become part of our culture and are so admired that film geeks will discuss everything from acting to shot composition to story and beyond. I mean, just look at June of 1987 again. The Untouchables, Witches of Eastwick, Predator, Spaceballs. These are as epic today as they were then. How about some other films made that same year? Full Metal Jacket, RoboCop, The Princess Bride, Lethal Weapon, Wall Street, Evil Dead 2, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Dirty Dancing, The Lost Boys, Good Morning Vietnam, Hellraiser, The Running Man, Fatal Attraction, The Monster Squad, La Bamba. The list goes on and on. And that's just one year in the 80s. Today you're lucky if one film stands out for the whole year. And chances are, it's not even an original story. In 2024, you have to go down the list all the way to the 16th biggest earner before hitting a movie that isn't a sequel or a prequel. That's insane. And tell me honestly, as much fun as Deadpool and Wolverine is, which I really enjoyed by the way, do you really think that people will be discussing it in 40 years the way they still discuss Predator to this day? Not a chance. In fact, they'll still probably be talking about Predator. It's hard to think of many modern films that are most likely to be as fondly remembered by future audiences. There are some that come to mind, to be sure. Dune, Dredd, Top Gun Maverick, Barbie, but let's be honest, they are few and far in between. At least in terms of pop culture mass appeal. Not flash in the pans that are popular for a month or even a year because it's fashionable, but movies with true staying power and good word of mouth that transcend years and generations. Those films are rarer than ever, and the audience knows it. That's why even the most expensive movies ever made are averaging the same per theater gross that films did 4 decades ago, with a fraction of the budget to make. And that's my point. It's not the money being thrown at the screen that's the problem. It's how that money is spent. Or should I say misspent? That's the issue. In the 70s, 80s, and well into the 90s, the idea was to make films as cheaply as possible while also as entertaining as possible, so as to attract as wide an audience and make the biggest profit. Today, the idea is to make movies as expensively as possible in order to please a small fraction of the audience, and hoping against hope that the wider audience will magically go along with it too. You see, back then, films were made with the audience in mind. If you're selling something, you make it as pleasing to the public as possible so that you can attract as many customers as possible. This meant writing stories and making films for specific demographics and adjusting budgets based on projected revenue in selling that product to those specific customers. You didn't want to spend too much if you knew there weren't apt to be as many buyers. And if a film broke out and became a hit beyond the target audience, like, say, RoboCop or Aliens, then all the better. Simple capitalism at play. Today, it's almost the polar opposite. Capitalism's a dirty word. Films are made with interest groups and echo chambers in mind. Many filmmakers are more concerned with what their peers and social media have to say than what the audience is actually asking for. They write films for themselves and their friends, and many openly deride or even detest what should be their target audiences. But that in and of itself isn't so bad. There have always been filmmakers on the fringes making content for small audiences. The difference is, those filmmakers were not the ones at the helm of movies that should otherwise be blockbusters. And even they had the temerity to try to make their stories as good as possible. Can the same be said today? Surely even those of you still arguing that the box office of today eclipses that of years past will admit the stories told today are nowhere near as original or as good. I mean, how can they be when the majority of hit films are sequels, prequels, or remakes? Which is not to say you can't have a great sequel or remake. Star Trek II and The Thing are living proof of that. But the writing in those films is as strong as you'll find in a movie, sequel or otherwise. And maybe that's what I'm getting at the most. It's the quality of storytelling that to me is lacking the most, especially at the higher budgets. When you rely on just one or two films to support your entire business because you've poured all your money into them, then you absolutely have to be as safe as possible with that product. And that's what it is. A product. Not a film or a story, but just a commercial product. You will strip it of anything that could be looked at as controversial or offensive, even if it actually isn't, or worse, even if it's what drew people to it in the first place. Your only goal for that product is to have a great opening weekend, because that's where upwards of 80 to 90% of your entire box office will come from. You see, if a film has a ton of hype, but no substance, then it might have a great opening weekend and make back a decent portion of its budget. But the following weekend will see such a drop-off in ticket sales that it'll be gone from theaters in mere weeks, and chances are you'll be lucky to break even. And it's all thanks to that one opening weekend. So what do you get for all that money that was invested? Predictable, safe, and ultimately utterly forgettable films made by committee, where that committee is made up of executives, activists, accountants, and lawyers, but hardly ever, it seems, by skilled writers who are genuine fans of the subject matter or genre. Maybe that's not fair. I know for a fact there are plenty of great writers around. Hell, I'm one of them. But at the ludicrous budget levels of today's giant movies, their voices are the last to be heard. Or is it the first to be ignored? It's hard to say. But I know several writers whose scripts were changed by people that had no business going near those scripts, simply because of ego or fear. There's a rinse and repeat strategy for many films today. Copy what someone else has already done, but in such a way as to walk on eggshells the whole time. Or they give you a bait and switch, where the trailers and press releases promise one thing, but the film delivers an entirely different and ultimately disappointing experience altogether. Don't offend anyone. Don't take risks with characters or dialogue or plot lines. Instead, lean into tropes and cliches, embrace stereotypes, and take out all the excitement that comes with unpredictability and genuine stakes, and replace it all with lots and lots of CGI. And that's the thing, isn't it? Spectacle doesn't equal story. Oh sure, it can be a fun ride, but not a particularly memorable one. And that's what the stories of the past gave us so much more often than today. hungry storytellers who were willing to take risks in front of and behind the camera, and especially at the story level. They didn't have tons of money, so they made every cent count. They didn't have the benefit of endless reshoots and a fawning media to cover up poor storytelling. They had one chance to get it right, and so they made sure that their scripts were as good as they could be for the audience that the film was intended for. And how did they know? Because they were part of that audience themselves. James Cameron makes great sci-fi because he's a sci-fi nerd. Quentin Tarantino makes great crime movies because he lived and breathed every crime movie ever made. John Carpenter makes great horror because he's a true horror geek. Catherine Bigelow makes great action movies because she truly understands and loves the genre. Can the same be said when a filmmaker who prefers, say, heavy drama is given a pop bubblegum superhero film? Or a writer who's only ever written period pieces is tasked to write a space opera? Or a studio exec who only ever produced rom-coms is suddenly making horror movies? Yeah, the studio and by extension the audience might get lucky, but the betting money is firmly on those projects failing right out of the gate. So when I ask why don't people like going to the movies anymore, it's because they don't like the movies being made. Or more to the point, they don't like the stories being told. Audiences have been tricked so many times into seeing bad films pushed as good that they've lost their faith. So rather than spending hard-earned money to see a questionable movie in the theaters, they opt to wait and see it for free on streaming a few weeks later. It's only the big movies that are hyped up enough, and I'm actually happy to say the occasional smaller genre films, that see box office returns these days. And even any of those are hit and miss. Movies need a return to that 70s, 80s, and 90s model of good old-fashioned storytelling, with relatable characters, great dialogue, and purposeful action, with real stakes for the characters and audiences alike, with twists and turns that genuinely surprise and hit an emotional chord, with budgets that aren't bloated or wasteful, but carefully tied to the genre and type of film being made, and ultimately, with actual love for the story being told, and passion for the genre in which it lives. Because audiences aren't dumb, and they can smell an imposter a mile away. So let's go back to giving audiences what they actually want. I say, let's make stories great again. But these are just my 2 cents. Give me yours. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the state of movies, and if you think a return to the 80s is what we need in our filmmaking model. And if you'd like to support this channel and see more of my work, please click the links below and check out my horror novel Iron Dogs, available in ebook, print, and audiobook, or my latest film Spin the Wheel, out now on Tubi. As always, if you like what you saw, click that like button, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell to stay updated with the latest content. Until next time, stay creative.